Hi, my name is Matt Florell. I'm doing a presentation on carrier scam likely phone call flagging. This is something that has come up in the last few years. It has become more problematic for some people, some companies. So, this is a little primer on what it is, how it works, how it doesn't work, and how to get around it if you have to. So, without further ado, what exactly is scam likely and why am I seeing it on my cell phone? Well, it was first rolled out widely for free by T-Mobile, a mobile carrier, cell phone carrier in the United States in 2017. It was not a full rollout. They were only doing this with partner companies to start with. They used the scam likely label. Other carriers have used potential fraud or spam call or some other commercial phone call warnings, depending upon the carrier and the applications they're using. The stated purpose, at least for T-Mobile, was to warn their customers of nefarious callers or robocalls. And some carriers, not T-Mobile, do charge $1 to $5 a month for these phone call screening services. How does it work? That's an excellent question. Nobody knows. It's proprietary for every carrier. And it changes. It's not the same scam likely system today as it was 2 years ago. We do have some good ideas based upon how it behaves, how it works. And we have several clients that have done some more research and active monitoring through the use of actual phone calls on a daily and sometimes multiple times a day basis to monitor their own phone numbers. It is entirely based on caller ID phone numbers for these phone calls, although currently, as Stir Shaken has taken off and been adopted more widely, that has started to have been included in the scam likely system. We'll talk more about Stir Shaken towards the end of this presentation. Most carriers use a combination of outside services, third-party services that aggregate data, and their own internal call log activity to determine the likelihood of a phone call being a robocall. And it's good to mention that the scam likely system does not care if it's a legal robocall or an illegal robocall, or a sales-based, or a service-based, or even a public emergency-based. The system is blind to all that. All it cares about is mass numbers of phone calls that are likely to be getting placed in bulk. Also, the scam likely system is decentralized. It is not always consistent across different regions. You could be calling New Jersey and then have your phone number flagged as a scam likely phone number, and then you could be calling California and not be flagged. Most of the time, these systems will synchronize at some point, but we have seen it where across multiple days, one region does not have you flagged, whereas another region does. The factors, what can get your phone number flagged? Number one, now this is across almost all carrier-based scam likely type flagging systems, placing phone calls to non-existing phone number prefixes. If you're in the United States or anywhere in the NANPA galaxy, which is Canada, the US, and most of the Caribbean, if your fourth digit is a 0 or a 1, that is a non-existing phone number prefix. There are also tens of thousands of other non-existing phone number prefixes. But if your area code begins with a 0 or 1, or your 7-digit number begins with a 0 or 1, it does not exist. It cannot be an existing phone call. These carriers will notice that, and they will flag based upon phone calls being directed to them and going to exchanges or number prefixes that do not exist. Secondarily, non-provisioned phone numbers. So the phone number gets to an existing prefix or phone exchange, but the phone number doesn't exist. It's not provisioned, was canceled. If they start seeing a large number of phone calls to either of these two, it's a good indicator that they will probably flag you sooner rather than later. They also look at the number of phone calls placed in total over the last 5 minutes, 30 minutes, 60 minutes. That can go up depending upon the carrier. Sometimes it's total calls to the carrier. Sometimes it's to the specific region or exchange. For instance, if you start calling a sequential list, that is a very good way of getting flagged right away. The average length of the answered phone call is another indicator. If these phone calls get hung up within 10 seconds, that's another factor. So these are kind of the big four. There are some other things depending upon the system and how their scam likely system works that can contribute to that, but these are the most common reasons. Next, the limits. Minimum. It takes a minimum of 5 minutes, we've found, for a caller ID number to get flagged as a scam likely call. Also 200 phone calls, that's kind of on the low end. It's not that common that few phone calls can get it flagged, but depending upon the type of calling, that could cause it to happen. We did see one client who showed us evidence that they placed over 20,000 phone calls in a day before one of their CID numbers got flagged the next morning. Once you stop using a caller ID number, it can take from 2 to 21 days for the flag to be removed. This is, again, variable. It seems to depend upon the length of time that caller ID number was used. So it doesn't necessarily care about the number of phone calls. It's just for how long you used it. So that will become important later, as we'll see. Just to look at the scale of how these systems operate, we'll look at the most widely deployed system, which is T-Mobile, because they started offering this as a service for free. They weren't charging initially. Right now, they have 104.8 million subscribers in the U.S. They average about 700 million phone calls per day. This has gone up since the pandemic. I believe it's starting to go down again from what I've seen, but just the scale of having to maintain a database and do analysis of the type that they have to do for a scam likely system on over 14 billion phone calls in a 3-week period, and be able to send that data, do the lookup, and then send it back to the phone to be able to display whether it's a scam likely or not, requires a very robust system. As I already mentioned, it's decentralized, but you still need a lot of processing power to be able to handle something that does analytics. This is not just routing phone calls. This is doing lookups and analysis on past history of phone calls and having to figure out whether it thinks that it's a scam likely robocall or not. The problems with scam likely, there are quite a few. It's only based on the caller ID number. It's not where the call has actually come from. Unfortunately, this has led to an increase in spoofed or random caller ID use because the system is designed to work only on caller ID numbers. There's no way it can handle that. So when you start seeing a bunch of random, supposedly local phone numbers appearing on your phone, most likely they are spoofed caller ID, and that's a complete workaround for how the scam likely system works. As I mentioned, the inconsistent flagging methods are a big issue. There are no set of rules you can follow, absolute rules, to get around the scam likely system. Some carriers will not route these calls at all, or they'll send them immediately to voicemail instead of passing them along to your telephone. They'll just handle them internally, and sometimes you'll have no idea that somebody called. The flagging for most carriers works based upon a proprietary built-in cell phone application, meaning you can't even set up a GSM gateway to do this. It's based upon software that's built into that phone. So there's no API. There are some outside services that offer call reputation lookups, but they're not guaranteed to be used by whatever carrier you're calling, and they're not guaranteed to be accurate or timely. Most of those systems update once a day or sometimes once a week, which for some applications is just not good enough. The collateral damage, you can find a lot if you start searching, and we've heard from clients as well of what kind of problems these false positives for Scam Likely. Appointment reminder systems, pharmacy automated phone systems, healthcare providers calling with reminders or checkups on patients, family members calling other family members too frequently can get you flagged as Scam Likely. And of course, victims of caller ID spoofing. And that leads into our real world example from one of our clients. This is a long running client of ours, been a client for years. They're a very large insurance industry company in the healthcare industry. They have a system that does manual dial only, no automated phone calls at all. And they're calling healthcare providers. They're calling only commercial accounts. They have used the same 1-800 toll-free number for this division as their caller ID number on all their outbound calls from this division for decades. It's very well known. Unfortunately, what happened for them in the last year is that another company, not nearly as reputable, we don't even know who it is, started using their 800 toll-free number as a caller ID for their robocalling campaign. And that's when our clients' calls started to get flagged through no fault of their own. So this resulted in an instant, in one day, drop of 20% in their contacts calling healthcare providers. They were fielding calls coming in and also dealing with the calls they were placing out of their providers wary of these flagged phone calls. They were having to have their agents waste time assuring providers that they were in fact calling from the insurance company. Some of these they had been calling for decades using this same number. So this was a major problem for them through no fault of their own. For mitigation or attempted mitigation, they reported the issue to their carrier. Nothing ever came of it. They never found out who this company was that was doing it. There are some carriers like Verizon that have a caller ID validation program. Of course, that only affects Verizon customers. T-Mobile does have a manual process they can go to validate caller IDs. However, if you are not a T-Mobile subscriber, it is quite unlikely you will not be accepted, from what I've read and from what I've heard. What this client ended up doing is they temporarily switched to a new outbound caller ID phone number, an unused one that they had for testing in their system. And they basically, for the rest of the day and for the next few days, they were placing calls using that alternate caller ID phone number. But they wanted a solution that would allow their calls to not be flagged. So that's where we came in. We added a feature to Vici Dial, our product, that would auto-rotate caller ID phone numbers, calling 8 hours a day, which is when they called business hours, rotating a caller ID every 5 minutes. And when you only place calls out every 5 minutes, the maximum flagging reset time seems to be about 2 to 3 days in our experience. So they ended up reserving 288 caller ID phone numbers so they could use this rotation feature. It, of course, exploits the Scam Likely minimum detection time of 5 minutes and the reset trigger time of 2 to 3 days. And they can now switch to this auto rotation solution at any time and guarantee that they have no Scam Likely phone calls. They are currently back to using that 800 number they were using before. But this gives them the ability, in case that unfortunate situation happens again, they will have a way of working around it and guaranteeing that they won't be flagged as Scam Likely. So what about Stir Shaken? That solves one of the problems with Scam Likely because it's a certification protocol that sends along an attestation, legal term there, of a call's origin. So there's A, B, C, and then none. A is the same originator carrier as the caller ID DID carrier. B is different but verified originating carrier and the CID carrier. C is the company placing the phone calls is very verified, but the caller ID carrier is unknown, unverified. And then having no stir shaken data on a call at all returns no attestation at all. This goes through SIP protocol, asterisk, and open SIPs and other open SIP devices, gateway devices will work with stir shaken. We earlier this year added an add-on to ViCiDial as part of our code base that allows it to work with stir shaken through some providers, like Tiltex is one of the companies that has their own, as well as they offer it as an outsource to carriers to use as a stir shaken solution. It's one of the better ones that we've worked with. No, I'm not getting paid to say that. Stir shaken is not fully implemented yet. There are several exemptions that will exist for years as it is now. Some carriers are having problems implementing that. We have run into that with some of our clients. So stir shaken is not a complete solution. Let's see here. And from what we've seen, from what carriers have already said, some big carriers, they will keep using their separate scam likely system in addition to stir shaken. We have seen some carriers already blocking C attestation and no attestation calls right now. Some of them are using only B attestation and then doing their scam likely lookups on those phone numbers. Some of them are doing scam likely lookups on everything. So they're basically playing along with stir shaken, but they're not using any of the data for anything right now. The good news for the future is that stir shaken should remove the need for scam likely flagging systems entirely. That's part of the guaranteed, you know where your phone calls are coming from. But we don't know if all carriers are going to be removing their scam likely flagging systems. So there's no guarantee that this is something that we won't have to worry about in a few years. Here's an example of what the auto rotation caller ID admin screen looks like inside of ViCiDial. It will flag the timestamp of when the calls were last used. You can have it use a minimum number of calls, a minimum number of minutes to auto rotate, and it's built right into the web interface. The future, full integration with stir shaken, used by U.S. carriers within the next few years. As I said, should make it a thing of the past. The FCC recently proposed shortening the implementation time period for smaller carriers using stir shaken to 1 year. This would go into effect less than a year from now if that passes. I'm not sure it's going to. There's also the issues to deal with legacy systems not fully answered by this. So we'll see what happens. Not really sure. But I'm sure it will cause lots of chaos, as Scam Likely and Stir Shaken have in the telecom industry so far. And that's it. That's our presentation. After November 2nd, November 3rd, we will have a copy of this PDF up on our website, vicidal.org. And that's it. Thank you very much. And on to the questions.